Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of webinars produced and presented by the Cultural Diversity and Social Justice ASPA of the Society for Music Teacher Education. My name is Dr. Amanda Soto from Texas State University, and I have served as co-chair of the Cultural Diversity and Social Justice ASPA since 2014. This webinar marks the first of three that we have scheduled for the 2016-2017 school year and have been coordinated by the three co-chairs of the ASPA. They are myself, Dr. Juliet Hess from Michigan State University, and Dr. Carol Frierson Campbell from William Patterson University. Information regarding these webinars is available at our website, smte.us. The link is in the chat box, and also on our Facebook group page. The link is also posted on the chat box up above. We have also included the information in our first ever newsletter, Seasons of Change, which was distributed this winter. Please make sure to subscribe to our listserv and Facebook group page. Furthermore, this webinar will be recorded and posted on our SMTE webpage along with our past webinars to be utilized as a resource. Today's webinar focuses on the topic, Culturally Responsive Teaching and Music Education, from Understanding to Application. Dr. Connie McKoy is an associate professor and director of undergraduate studies in the School of Music, College of Visual and Performing Arts at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She holds a BM degree from the Oberlin Conservatory and master's and PhD degrees in music education from UNCG. McKoy's research, which has been published widely, focuses on the cultural competence of pre-service music teachers and culturally responsive teaching in music. Dr. Vicki R. Lynn is an associate professor at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. She holds a BME and an MME from Wichita State University and a PhD degree from the University of Arizona. Lynn's research, published in national and international journals, focuses on the issue of equity and access to high-quality music education and culturally responsive teaching of music. In a few moments, we will hear from both Dr. McKoy and Dr. Lynn. First, some quick instructions for those of you online. To view this webinar with the slides in full screen, simply click on the full screen icon with 4 arrows shown in the upper right corner of the main screen. You are also able to hide the video panel by clicking on the View Options tab located next to the green highlighted bar up on the top of your screen there. The microphone icon on your screen should have a red line across it indicating that it is now muted. Please stop your video by clicking the video icon, camera icon, if I have not already done so for you. You will have opportunities to interact with our presenters at the end of their presentation. Please use the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to submit questions or comments when the Q&A portion of the webinar has begun. If you do not have access to a keyboard to type your question, please unmute yourself and ask your question. When you're finished asking your question or responding to the presenters, please turn off your microphone. This session is scheduled to last 45 minutes, which includes the Q&A portion. And now I would like to present Dr. Vicki Lynn and Dr. Connie McKoy.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you for asking us to do this. And thank all of you who have joined us. We're excited about this evening. So Connie and I have been friends and colleagues for over 10 years. From the first time we met, our conversations have gravitated to topics that are centered around race, ethnicity, and culture and music learning. Both Connie and I have read the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, Lisa Delpit, Geneva, and many others. And their ideas about culture and learning have really resonated with both of us. At the same time we were just getting to know each other, we were witnessing a growing interest in the issues related to culture and music learning across the country. Conferences specifically focused on race, ethnicity, and culture were being offered all over. And we started to see courses on diversity being added to music education programs. Journal articles exploring best practices started in music education journals. It was an exciting time for us, and we began to see our professional interest from our colleagues around the world reflected our passion and our concern for music ed. Because of our backgrounds and our strong beliefs in the value of diverse ways of thinking and knowing, we recognized the need for a resource specific to music teaching, a resource that would explore approaches to teaching and learning that were responsive to cultural needs and the strengths of our learners. Thus, we began to form the idea of writing a book on culturally responsive teaching. We did not have a single audience in mind when we started this project. We hoped the book would be helpful for pre-service music teachers who were learning about culturally responsive teaching in the general education classes and needed to transfer that understanding to the music room. We also wrote this book as a central resource for music ed faculty for use in undergraduate and graduate methods courses. And we kind of hoped that this would be a text that would in-service teachers learn more about culturally responsive teaching, about themselves, about their students, and inspire them by the real-world examples that we've provided.
This book was also the next step in a logical sequence of research that we had begun, Vicki and I and our colleague Abby Butler, who's at Wayne State University, focusing on the impacts of culture and race and ethnicity on music learning. And so we got the idea to develop a conceptual model based on a review and synthesis of research that we had conducted to see if this model might be able to illustrate how culture impacts teaching and learning in music. Since we developed the model, we've been testing its viability, and we've looked at several theories and sort of compared or overlapped the conceptual model with those theories to see if they correspond in any way. And one of the theories that we discovered actually fit pretty well was culturally responsive teaching. We found that by overlaying the conceptual model with theories associated with culturally responsive teaching and culturally relevant pedagogy, we had a way to talk about how these theories could be applied in a music education context. So as you can see by looking at the model, it's comprised of 5 dimensions: teacher, learner, content, instruction, and context. And within each of these dimensions are components which we believe are impacted by race, ethnicity, culture, and by virtue of being impacted by these 3 areas, or a combination of them, could either serve as barriers to music learning or could support music learning. You'll notice that the teacher and learner are the 2 primary agents in this model, and their components actually are identical. And as we were preparing for this webinar, it occurred to me, probably for the first time, that although we may have had specific roles in mind when we said teacher and learner, in other words, we think of specific people when we say teacher and specific people when we say learner, but those who are currently seen as learners could actually be teachers, and those who are seen as teachers are often those who can learn. So having those components be the same across both of those dimensions is really important, I think. The other point I want to make about the dimensions is that the model may make it appear as though these dimensions are discrete, but in actuality, to illustrate in one-dimensional way or a two-dimensional way phenomena that may be occurring in a conceptual model. Nevertheless, this model has served as the foundational framework for our book.
When we began to work, we knew that we had 2 major goals. We wanted to provide information that would help the reader understand culturally responsive teaching really within the context of music and music learning. And we wanted to have information that reflected real-world applications. In the first section, we focused on ideas and concepts that would help the reader understand culturally responsive teaching within that context. Relating back to our conceptual model, we chose to write about how culture impacts us as teachers, how culture impacts learners' experiences in the music classroom, and how culture matters when we look at the classroom, school, and community. In the second section, we really described how the principles can be applied in those same 3. And then we concluded the book with our idea of what music education might look like.
So there are several main ideas that we wanted to emphasize in section 1 of the book, and we want to share some of those with you right now. One of these ideas is addresses the question of why we should actually care about culturally responsive teaching as music educators. And one reason is that music and culture are intimately related. It's one of several forms of expression through which we are able to at least attempt to understand and know cultures of the world and microcultures in the United States. Another reason is that Music is a source of identity for many cultural groups. And if we teach music without taking into account the cultural meaning that it may have for students, we may be overlooking an important point of reference that can assist them in constructing new knowledge. And we also may increase the likelihood that our students will view school music programs as highly relevant to their own lives, as well as their particular and individual musical goals. We also felt it was extremely important to provide some background on the development of culturally responsive teaching. When the desegregation of schools began in earnest in the 1960s, teachers often observed disparities in academic achievement between white students and students of ethnic and racial minorities. During this period of time, a deficit theoretical model was formulated to explain these disparities. So according to this paradigm, children who were not academically successful were said to come from backgrounds that were culturally disadvantaged or deprived. And this perspective was based on research conducted between 1959 and 1968, so it's pretty much a 10-year span. This research identified so-called traits of poverty. This may sound very familiar to you. And these traits of poverty were said to account for the academic difficulties that poor children from these areas experienced in school. So this idea of a cultural deficit paradigm held sway for a while, but in the late 70s and the early 80s, there were some new voices in education that began to develop theories that countered the deficit paradigm and proposed that all students had rich cultural backgrounds, and that it was actually the school environment that needed to provide instruction that was meaningful and relevant to a diverse student population. The principles of culturally responsive teaching or culturally relevant pedagogy came directly from the work of Gloria Ladson-Billings, who was the first to develop a theoretical framework for this approach to teaching. And it was developed in part from observations that she had conducted with African American teachers and seeing how they worked with their students. And this is, and she later chronicled these observations in this work in her book, The Dream Keepers. It's interesting to note that there are certain people today, Ruby Payne is one of them, who are espousing ideas based on the same deficit model suggested in the 1960s. The model, these are ideas that purport that a culture of poverty whose values run counter to those of the middle classes is responsible for the academic failure of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And of course, many of the students in low socioeconomic backgrounds are disproportionately from racial and ethnic minorities. So this is why Vicki and I felt it was really, really important to try to provide a historical context for those who might be reading our book, because it's important to understand not only why culturally responsive teaching is so critical to us today, but to realize that some of the ideas that are being suggested by people in education that focus on a deficit paradigm are really hark back to theories that were developed years and years ago, which have been found to be irrelevant or misguided.
So at about the same time as culturally responsive pedagogy was appearing in general education, we started talking about multicultural music in music education. Partly as a result of the civil rights movement, but really out of a desire to reflect a more diverse way of thinking about music, teachers began their curriculum and they started teaching music from many cultures in the classroom. The repertoire expanded, as did the opportunities for students to participate in different music-making traditions. A multicultural approach certainly made a positive impact on music learning, but multicultural music is not what we are talking about. Culturally responsive teaching differs from multicultural music in that it doesn't focus on the content, but rather acknowledges the unique characteristics of the students in our classrooms and strives to connect the content to the learner's cultural backgrounds. In section 1, we discussed how teachers are impacted by their own cultural heritage. How I teach, what I choose to teach, how I define the purpose of music education, and how that purpose is manifested in my classroom is impacted by my own cultural background. Again, for those of you joining us tonight, consider your background and how it impacts the decisions you make in your classroom is so closely connected to the experiences we've had in our lives.
So we talked a lot in section 1 about asking teachers to think about and reflect about how their cultural backgrounds and their cultural heritages influence how they teach and their approaches to teaching. But it's also important to understand things about our students. And so that was also a part of that section. And we talked about the impact of how the impact of cultural norms and traditions not only influence how students learn, but it might influence how they may choose to approach learning tasks. One thing that was really interesting for me as I was working and reading and preparing this book was that many of our early ideas about how and when children learn have been based upon research conducted primarily with children in Western European cultures, or cultures that are based on Western European principles and philosophy, educational philosophy. But we're learning that perceptions about what children are able to do and when they're able to do it really do vary across cultural communities. This means that what's been discovered about cognition may not actually apply across all cultures. So for example, cultural communities may differ in the value they place on certain cognitive tasks. Some value the ability to work collaboratively with others in solving problems. Others value speed in problem solving. Some cultural communities value technical skill, while others value social and emotional skills. Some view cognition as a single process, while others see it as integrated with other characteristics, such as wisdom, responsibility, and morality. We also explored several other factors related to race, ethnicity, and culture that we feel inform how students learn in music. And these included theories of music preference, theories about how culture can shape musical identity, and how music can shape cultural and individual identity, gender identity in music, and the role of oral learning in music education and in music making across many cultural communities.
So we really felt that there were several underlying understandings that framed our book. And we just want to take a few minutes to go through these understandings. First, no culture is better than another, nor is one way knowing right or wrong. I think we'd all acknowledge that music education has traditionally been rooted in Western classical traditions. There's been an overt hierarchy of what was considered quality music, and musicianship skills were evaluated based on one's ability to read and notate music. I recently read a thread in a music education blog focused specifically on the question of what is considered quality music. While we don't disagree that the classical canon has merit, that reading and writing are valuable skills, we want to likewise value diverse music and diverse music-making traditions. Second, we know that culture is not simple. We are influenced by a myriad of factors. And if I really think about it, all of the things that make me, well, we're all unique. Connie and I may agree on a lot of things. You see us nodding our heads when we talk, but we have very different perspectives on other things. Likewise, our students will have similarities and differences, and it takes time and it takes effort to really get to know them. One important point that I really try to strive to teach my undergraduates is that stereotypes do very little to help us understand our students. I was talking to a group of college students in Oklahoma recently, and I asked them what types of stereotypes were perpetuated within the music classroom. It didn't take them very long for them to identify typical stereotypes that permeate our profession. For those of for you attending the webinar, think about your experiences. Has anyone assumed something about you that wasn't true? Or have you ever assumed something about others? The next point that we wanted to stress, and Connie's already touched on this, is one that we feel is just crucially important. Difference does not equal deficit. You'll hear us say it again and again. Difference does not equal deficit. And in fact, we see diversity as an asset. Isn't creativity all about finding different approaches and different ways of saying things? We really value diversity and want to see that honored. We also acknowledge that culture is not static. All of us change. I'm certainly not the same teacher I was even 2 years ago. Why would we assume our students will always stay the same, or that our teaching can remain unchanged and the needs of our students? And finally, we want to acknowledge the historical and sociocultural factors influencing music teaching and learning. And we know that the better we understand these influences, the better we'll be able to mediate what has gone on before and what needs to happen as we move forward. How did our traditional ensembles assume their position in the schools? Whose music has historically been taught in schools? What music making traditions have been and which have been excluded? These questions are important as we work to create a vision for culturally responsive teaching.
So in the second section of the book, we had the opportunity to demonstrate how culturally responsive teaching could be applied in the classroom, what it looks like. And not only what it looks like in the classroom, but also in school and also in the community, or how school and community connect to what's going on in your classroom through culturally responsive teaching. And we were particularly excited about using the voices and experiences of teachers whom we had identified as using culturally responsive pedagogy as a significant component of their approach to teaching music. We felt that this was extremely important so that readers could see that the theories and rationales introduced in the first section of the book could actually be applied effectively in real-world contexts. We also realized it was important to show the journey that these teachers embarked upon to arrive at a place where they saw culturally responsive teaching as critical to their work as music educators, because we have maintained throughout the book that culturally responsive teaching isn't so much pedagogical or a pedagogical approach as it is a mindset. And it required our teachers to really do a lot of reflection and a lot of reflecting on themselves and their ideas about teaching and their philosophies of teaching as they sought to employ these ideas.
So the teachers whose stories are told throughout this last section of the book did first describe themselves as reflective practitioners. They talked about examining their own beliefs and biases and their own preferences. Read the book, I apologize, I'm going to give you an example from it, but one of the teachers talked about working with a group of Latino students who had recently immigrated to the States. During a one-on-one conversation, the student exclaimed, "You don't even like us. You never touch us. You say good job, but you don't even pat us on the back." For a young teacher who had been warned in his undergraduate courses to never touch a student, the comment was a bit shocking. He began to realize that certain students needed some type of physical connection to feel valued, while other students needed to maintain space. Had he not cared enough to have that conversation, he would never have challenged his own ideas or the ideas of his college professors who had warned him about touching a student. And I have to say, that's given me pause, because I'm one of those college professors who has talked to my students about never touching their students. I think we really need to explore best practices and what our students need. This story also illustrates how culturally responsive teachers take the time to get to know their students. Every teacher we interviewed described how they work to really get to know them, understand their backgrounds, listen to their music, and learn about what they value. The teachers would then use what they learned to create an environment that was welcoming, one that honored different ways of learning, different ways of communicating, and different ways of music traditions. Often the teachers tried making program changes on what they learned about their students. From the band director who created a modular system that allowed students to participate in diverse music ensembles, to the general music teacher who incorporated the Spanish lyrics for "Stand By Me" after her students shared the Prince Royce version, teachers listened to their students and they acted upon what they learned.
The benefits of using culturally responsive teaching practices in the music classroom can be expanded if the school culture is one that supports those efforts. School culture is comprised of a myriad of factors ranging from the perceived physical and emotional safety of students to attitudes, beliefs, perceptions, and the written and unwritten rules that influence every aspect of how a school functions. School culture can be characterized as negative or positive, and we identified several of the characteristics of negative or toxic schools in our book. But for this evening, suffice it to say that the positive school culture exists where conditions for maximum learning have been identified and prioritized by everyone involved in the school. So this means not only the teachers and the learners, but staff, parents, and the community. Many schools have been able to change their culture from toxic to positive by recognizing that each of these groups has a stake in the outcome. One of the teachers that we interviewed talked about how the faculty at her school were involved in what the administration called courageous conversations. The faculty committed to asking really hard questions of themselves and to talk about the things that they could do to develop a true sense of community within and beyond the school. Another teacher whose instrumental program didn't follow the traditional models typically found in many high schools talked about a significant turning point when his students stopped comparing themselves to their peers and other schools and began to take pride in the fact that they were playing music that had cultural relevance for them. This shift was felt in the community too, because they began to take ownership of the program, that is, the community did, because they could see how it was benefiting the students. Several teachers talked about the importance of not only reflecting on their own attitudes and perspectives, but listening to their colleagues who may have had different life experiences that have informed their thoughts and actions. Being willing to learn from people from different cultural backgrounds and backgrounds different than our own can go a long way to helping us get a better sense of how we think, feel about, and react to cultural diversity, as well as how race, ethnicity, and culture influence students' experiences in school.
The community is the next part of our triumvirate. Connecting to the community is an important tenet of culturally responsive teaching. And the teachers that we interviewed gave us some really great examples of how to connect in ways that were responsive and relevant. And really, when we think about it, getting to know the community is just an important part of getting to know our students. Understanding our students requires that we know what music they hear, who is part of their lives, and what's valued around them. Spending time around the school, going to places that our students might frequent, and just spending time in the communities to which our students belong can help us better meet the needs of those in our classroom. And this is particularly important for teachers who teach in a community that differs from the one they live in. I taught in a school that was 15 miles from my house, and the community was quite different. So I'd go to coffee houses, and I would try to go to grocery stores and music that was being played to become more familiar with the music my students were hearing on a daily basis. Developing community partnerships is not a new idea, and in fact, I think in music we do it pretty well. But what we heard were also some cautionary tales from teachers that we interviewed about making sure that when we did connect with the community, that the ideas were well crafted and thought out so as not to reinforce the concepts of privilege or to highlight the inequality that exists. Designing community partnerships where students are co-creators and co-learners with the community helps to ensure that the relationship is a common relationship with common goals. In the book, we gave several examples of teachers who brought community members into the classroom to make learning more relevant. And I want to share one example of something that didn't work out too well. One of the string teachers we interviewed described how she had worked with a friend of hers to have a group of students who were studying privately, come visit her class and show what they were able to do. She thought it would be helpful to have students around the same age playing string instruments demonstrate their ability. Although she had really good intentions, she talked about it backfiring on her, and she actually says it was a mistake that really bothered her. The students who were guests in the classroom represented the outsider or the others. They had very expensive instruments in velvet cases, and they played beautifully, and all of them took private lessons. They didn't reflect the culture of the school or community in which this teacher taught. Realizing that her students needed role models that they could relate to, she started searching for a better fit. Eventually, she found out about the Sphinx organization, an orchestra that's comprised of Latino and African American musicians, and she eventually brought them in, and she's had them in several times. The result, as she described it, was just amazing. Her students from disconnected to connected to the music groups that were playing for them. One final thought about community involvement. Valuable learning can and does take place outside of the classroom, and just as we want community members entering into the classroom to be true partners, we should also consider having true partners out in the community and engaging community members in ways that are relevant and responsive to their lives. There are ways that your music ensemble can facilitate learning for those around them, and allowing your students to make music with community members during those off-campus visits can really be a rewarding experience.
We concluded the book by presenting our vision for culturally responsive music education. We offered a rationale for change, focusing on the importance of connecting music learning in the classroom to students' lives outside of the classroom and facilitating lifelong music making. We also noted that in order to achieve this vision, there was a need to address three competing forces that can serve to either facilitate or impede change. And they are K-12 education, professional organizations, and music teacher education. Regarding music teacher education, currently, because of the way in which, currently, because of the way in which each of these three systems that I just mentioned reinforce one another, the status quo is perpetuated, making change difficult. However, we offered some suggestions for implementing change within each of these three influential systems. So now, with regard to music teacher education, we ask questions such as whether there's a way for us to expand or broaden who has access to music teacher preparation at the collegiate level. Can we consider attracting music faculty with varying types of musical expertise? Can the curricula and music teacher preparation programs be revised to not only incorporate music from a variety of cultures on a consistent basis, but to be more coherent and less fragmented in the way subjects are presented and skills are developed? If music teacher education programs are revised, then professional organizations will need to change as well. For example, many music teacher organizations and music preparation programs seek accreditation from the National Association of Schools of Music. What effect could such a body have on music teacher education programs if the criteria for accreditation required that other musics were on an equal footing with Western European classical genres, and that other ways of knowing and other ways of making music were encouraged and supported? Our professional music education organizations serve an important role in the continuing development of both pre-service and in-service teachers. Currently, however, the activities of many of these organizations foster and perpetuate the status quo and often fail to support innovative, alternative, or global music practices. Again, the emphasis here is on providing support on an equal footing with more traditional music practices, rather than as a sideline to the more important so-called mainstays of a program. Too often, we have observed that what is valued and rewarded by our professional organizations are programs that excel at the familiar. The final system in our model is K-12 education. Interrupting this cycle at the K-12 level means engaging students creatively in the act of music making. By providing them with several viable paths to music study, including some that may align more closely to interests outside of school, we can revitalize the system and provide music instruction for a broader proportion of the student body. The kind of change that Vicki and I are proposing within each system can't happen independently of the other systems. There has to be communication between and among stakeholders from each of these systems we've identified in this cycle. Just as the systems currently reinforce each other in a cycle that supports the status quo, they could be just as reinforcing and fostering and perpetuating a new paradigm. This is the vision that we have for culturally responsive music education. And this is where we challenge our readers and we challenge you to think about what you might be able to do to make this vision a reality. So this is really what we had to share about our book tonight. And at this point, we're happy to entertain any questions that you might have, or if you have any comments that you wanted to share.
Amanda, you're muted.
Thank you, Dr. McKoy and Dr. Lynn, for your wonderful presentations. At this time, we welcome questions and comments from our attendees. Please use the chat box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to submit questions or comments. If you don't have access to a keyboard to type your question, you can unmute yourself and ask the question. And then when you are done, you can turn off your microphone. Thank you, and let's begin.
I'm
looking for the chat box and I can't see
down
it.
On your bottom of your screen, Connie, there should be, put the cursor and it'll pop up options to chat.
On the right side?
For me, it's on the bottom.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. Not seeing it.
I don't see. Oh, here we go. From Darren, culturally relevant versus culturally responsive. Are they the same? Question mark.
Basically, yes, they are. They're sometimes use different terminology, but basically they are the same. Usually, I will say this, I know for certain that Gloria Ladson Billings' approach is typically termed culturally relevant pedagogy.
Yeah.
And the ideas and theories behind them are slightly different, but they all have to do with recognizing the strengths that various students bring to the classroom and making the content that they learn relevant to them, and understanding that they all have specific ways of constructing knowledge, some of which are culturally related.
Good question, though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, can you give an example of deficient versus different perspectives in action? So this, the deficit model, the philosophical part is that we're trying to fix something that's broken or make something better than. And I think one of the things that pops up in my mind, and I know there's several examples, is the dominance of starting with notation in our classrooms at an early age. We want students to be able to realize the musical traditions of a very specific population, when really if we look at world music and popular music and community music making, the oral tradition is more prevalent. But we want our students to be able to fit into that Western traditional mode. And I'm trying hard not to say inflammatory or predatory words, but we want them to fit into that classical tradition. So we set them up to feel like that's the end all be. On the other hand, it would be just as big of a mistake to say, oh, these students can't afford instruments. These students come from an impoverished area. And so we're just going to do popular music and we're never going to aspire to anything else outside of that. Both of them are, probably that your word irresponsible comes to mind, but both of those are deficit thinking. Responsive, we really look at the students that we are teaching, the music that they bring to the classroom, and the music that is available in the world around them. And we start with their strengths, we recognize their strengths, and we build upon those strengths equally. Connie, you want to weigh in on that one?
No, I think you actually answered that really, really well. I was going to talk about some of the things, particularly the fact that so many students are actually well-versed orally in terms of their music study, but we focus quite a bit, so much, especially in the upper levels, on music reading. And we forget, for example, that there are many cultures in the world that don't focus on music reading, that the music is transferred orally. And because music is an oral art, we really need to develop an oral repertoire of understanding, because that then informs our understanding of notation, because notation is symbolic. So I really think that that's when we look at students and sort of look askance at them because they don't read well, we assume if they don't read well, then they can't do other things well. And I think that's a mistake.
We have two great questions. Ooh, we have questions coming. So from Juliet Hess, I love the idea of culturally responsive teaching as more of a mindset than a pedagogy per se. Can you speak to why it might be more useful to take CRT up as a mindset?
I think sometimes, and I say this from experience, you know, when you go to a conference, a music conference, you tend to look for strategies and approaches that you can use in the classroom, like immediately. And I understand that the reason why we look for those things, because teaching is difficult, and teachers have to deal oftentimes with situations that make what they do very, very hard. I often talk about it sort of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You need to get certain things met, certain needs met before you can think in a broader way. But so I think that it's important, though, to think about culturally responsive teaching as a mindset, because it's not something, it's not necessarily a group of tips that you can employ unless you're totally committed to the idea of it. And if you're not careful about that, you can actually do more harm than good. So we really always say that you really, it has to come from a place where you understand some things about yourself, and where you're committed to understanding things about your students in order for the approach to be effective.
And that really leads nicely into the next question. Connie, I'll read it for you. Thank you for this great resource. This is from Lance Nielsen, and thank you, Lance, for saying that. I'm the supervisor of music for Lincoln Public Schools, and this year I've put together a cultural proficient focus group. We have been using your book as a book study. It's helped engage us in excellent dialogue. My questions are there any professional development that you would suggest? And I think what Connie was saying is that we have to really be careful about professional development models, because this isn't a tips and tricks. And even if we look at the examples that are in the books, some of the things that were relevant for one of the teachers would never work for another teacher, or wouldn't matter for another teacher. But I think what we can do as a profession is really focus on reflective practice. And I almost say that the first conference I went to, when we talked about reflective practice, I have a journal, and in my journal it says blah, 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 literally, because I wasn't led into it in a way that allowed me to think how much it mattered. I was told, okay, we're going to reflect on our teaching for 5 minutes. But really we have to investigate all of those things that make us us. And we have to be ready for hard questions. We have to be prepared for hard conversations. We have to be in a safe environment. So I think that it can be done, but I think it has to be crafted very carefully. It has to be collaborative. And, but I think that whole idea of it's not going to change if the mindset doesn't change.
I found the chat box, by the way.
Oh, congratulations.
Good job. Let's see the next question from Ruth, and says, if culturally responsive teaching depends on music teacher ideologies and dispositions, any ideas about how we can provide stronger experiences to the undergraduates and graduates in our programs that can assist them in developing cultural competence and reinforce for them that differences among people make our lives richer? The answer is yes. One of the things that I've done, it actually may seem like it runs counter to what Vicki had just said regarding professional development, but I'll say in general, I have drawn some ideas and strategies from general teacher education that focuses on culturally responsive teaching. And for example, I engage my students in what we call a privilege walk. And some of you may be familiar with this, where there are a series of statements that are made that sort of reflect the way society looks at people and how it values or doesn't value people. And if the students feel that the statement applies to them, then they take a step forward. And if it doesn't apply to them, they take a step back. And at the end of the activity, they all start out together in one line together. And at the end of the activity, they kind of look and see where they are. And those people who are farther forward are people for whom society would look at and sort of privilege in this society. And those who are not that far back experience things in their lives by society standards that don't privilege them. And I actually did it again and adapted that idea using some statements that relate to music and music teaching. And our students really found that interesting, as did I. I think trying to find environments for field experiences that would give your students an opportunity to teach in different types of environments is important. But, and when you do that, it's very important to unpack it, because research indicates that if you do it and you don't take time to talk to your kids about what they're experiencing, it can actually reinforce stereotypes about groups of people. And none of this is easy. It takes some time and effort, especially depending on where your school is. And so my suggestion would be to, do some reading in general education in relationship to culturally responsive teaching, and seeing how you can apply some of the ideas that have been utilized in general education, because they're completely applicable, I think, to music ed.
So we have a couple of quick conclusion comments. Kate, thank you very much for the nice comment. We appreciate that. And then we have the last question: acknowledging that culture is a complex concept and is not static, how does one with a limited knowledge of culturally responsive pedagogy begin to implement its principles in a meaningful way while dealing with ingrained stereotypes? I think that's such an interesting question. And it goes back a little bit to that reflective practitioner, and to realize that we have ingrained stereotypes, to acknowledge that is really important. And then for me, it's it happens over time. And so for me to overcome stereotypes, I had to get to know people outside of a group. I had to visit the community. I got to know families. I was invited into homes. I don't know if you can really break ingrained stereotypes unless you have the opportunity to get to know people for who they are as an individual.
Yeah, I think too that it's a matter of commitment.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say, because I say this to my students and I say this to in-service teachers that I've worked with, you can't be afraid to make mistakes. I still make some mistakes. And I think a lot of people, one of the things that maybe first of all, we just have to acknowledge that, especially in our culture, in our country, we don't like talking about this stuff. people get very uncomfortable with it. I think there are ways to approach it that might encourage people to open up a little bit more. But I think we all have to recognize that we screw up occasionally. And sometimes some people screw up more than others. But I think you can't let that possibility of making a mistake or possibility of offending keep you from having. That's why one of the teachers that we interviewed talked about courageous conversations. They're courageous because they're hard and they're scary, and people don't want to do them, you know. But you have to. And so even though you may not, everybody's walk is different. Everybody's journey is different. Some people have a long way to go. Some people not so long. But if you don't take the first step, you're always going to stay in the same place. So that's kind of how I look at it. You have to take a step forward, or else you're going to stay in the same spot.
And I want to make one final suggestion, because I have been very fortunate to have a colleague like Connie. And as you can imagine, Connie and I have had some of those hard and courageous conversations. And I think it's really helpful for anyone starting out to find somebody else who at least cares. They may not further along in the journey, or may not be as far along as you are, but find somebody who cares and who really wants to pursue this and have those hard conversations. Because talking with Connie has helped me identify some things in myself. I can always go to her and I can say, okay, Connie, I need some advice. I think this is happening. And we can have those conversations. So finding a like-minded colleague has been absolutely unbelievable in my journey.
And we learn from each other as well. I mean, I don't want people to run out and, you know, find someone of color and say, will you teach me, you know, what's going on, you know. But I think the nice thing about Vicki and me is that our friendship developed naturally. It wasn't, they didn't come to me initially saying, you know, I'm really interested in culturally responsive teaching. I want you to tell me, or I'm interested in culture. I want you to tell me, as a Black woman, what has been it didn't go that way. It was, we had these similar interests, and we're both educators. And the fact of the matter is we're similar in age and life, where we are in life, which was also something that we had in common. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, those were things that sort of drew us together, in addition to this desire to understand and investigate the impact of culture and race and ethnicity on music ed. So it really worked out well for us. And it's been a connection and a friendship and a professional connection that I have valued a great deal.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Do we have any final comments or questions before we wrap up? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks to everybody.
All right. We have come to the end of our time for this webinar. You're invited to be with us again on Tuesday, February the 21st, 2017 for our second webinar. The time and meeting link will be posted on our webpage and our Facebook page and sent to our listserv. It will be delivered by DJ Robinson from Boston University and Boston Public Schools. He will examine the intersections of race, power, and privilege in music education. For now, thank you for your attendance and participation today, and special thanks to our presenters, Dr. Vicki R. Lynn and Dr. Connie McKoy.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night. Have a wonderful day.
You too.